To everybody, and thank you so much for coming to this very important dialogue event. And I'm Michael Shifter, the president of the Inter-American Dialogue. And one of the issues that was highlighted in a recent book that we wrote about Latin America, and that comes up in every conversation about Latin America, is the region's unhappy distinction of being the most unequal region in the world. There has been progress reducing extreme poverty over the decade, but we still have very high levels of income and wealth inequality that are hindering sustainable growth and social inclusion. It is widely known, everybody says it in every discussion, that high quality, sound education is one of the drivers of economic and social development. But we also know the reality, which is that Latin America educational outcomes have improved on average. The region's poor and vulnerable communities are receiving subpar educational services from their governments or no services at all. To give some statistics, 14 million children are out of school. Of those who are in school, 30% are not reaching even the most basic levels of academic competency. And 40% of students who attend school drop out before they finish high school, with lower income students being the most likely to drop out. What we need now to do is to implement innovative and evidence-based strategies to improve educational outcomes for all, but especially for the most vulnerable in societies. We must look at empirical evidence from countries within and outside the region to understand what works, what doesn't work, and how to improve the quality of existing programs. We're here today to mark the launch of a new report of the Inter-American Dialogue and the Organization of American States, called the Inter-American Guide on Strategies for Reducing Educational Inequality. Our report seeks to provide a blueprint for evidence-based recommendations for improving education for every child in the Americas. We're very grateful to the Organization of American States, who we've partnered with on this and producing this report. I also want to thank the donor, the CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, for making this project possible. We very much appreciate their support. I also want to give special thanks and recognition to the Dialogue's superb team that works on education, led by Ariel Fishbein here, and Maria Oviedo, who's in the back, and also Sarah Stanton, who's outside. They just do an incredible job, and we're very grateful for everything they do. You'll be hearing from Ariel and Maria in a few moments. But we hope this day's discussion will shed light on what countries are doing to combat this issue, what we've learned from these efforts, and what we must do, we must focus on in the years ahead. So thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to introduce Kim Osborne from the Organization of American States that also wants to make some opening remarks. Kim?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Michael. I am very grateful to the Inter-American Dialogue for hosting this event and launching this report with us, and for inviting me to be part of the discussion on a matter of such critical importance and urgency for our region. I specifically wish to recognize the efforts of Ariel Fishbein, who worked with us a little bit, as well as on this report, and his team in preparing this guide, which we hope can inform all member states on some of the region's policy imperatives on education. My thanks also to my colleagues, Luis Porto, who's unable to join us at the last minute, and Betilde Munoz for their leadership on this issue. As the development arm of the OAS, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development, which I am privileged to lead, facilitates and fosters inclusive, resilient, and sustainable development in the Americas by promoting intersectoral dialogue for consensus building on key issues key priorities, as well as technical cooperation and public-private partnerships. Fostering inclusive development by increasing opportunities for all has been a central tenet of our work in the hemisphere. Despite significant progress over the last 15 years, as Michael indicated, Latin America and the Caribbean continue to have high poverty rates, while the people living in extreme poverty continue to rise. And while we saw a decline in inequality in the region, as Michael intimated earlier, is still among the most unequal in the world. Our region at this point faces periods of economic uncertainty and slow growth, influenced by the negative impacts of climate change, particularly on the rural poor, where livelihoods depend on subsistence agriculture, leading to rising levels of forced migration. We stand today at a critical point, as the gains achieved in the last decade, where 70 million people were lifted out of poverty and a growing middle class are at risk. Poverty is not solely the product of low or no income, but mainly the result of lack of opportunities. While social mobility in the region has improved, it remains very limited, and parents' education income levels still substantially influence their children's outcomes. We want to make sure that social mobility a reality for all, and we believe that education is the best tool to achieve it. Investing in education, therefore, is essential. This is the only way to provide all youth with equality of opportunity. In the last decade, access to primary education has become almost universal, and there has been significant improvement in secondary and tertiary education. However, levels of enrollment, years of schooling, and dropout rates vary greatly between the rich and the poor, and between the most and least vulnerable. This tells us that expanding education at all levels must move in tandem with providing quality education. Studies over the years, including one done by the Inter-American Development Bank, have also revealed that the performance of poorer students in our region is 2 years behind that of the richest. Not only are the poor students more likely to go to school with limited financial resources and ill-prepared teachers, they are also malnourished and at a huge disadvantage in their ability to learn. Today, where you live determines the type and quality of education you receive. So what do we do as a region and as a people? What can we do? In 2017, member states of the OAS adopted the Inter-American Education Agenda, which aims to strengthen inter-American cooperation and link efforts with other regional and sub-regional international entities to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. The agenda includes concrete lines of action within each of its 3 priority areas: quality and inclusive and equitable education, strengthening the teaching profession, and comprehensive early childhood care. The aim is not, or the focus is not on achieving a one-size-fits-all education system. This would be neither desirable nor feasible. No 2 countries or provinces are the same. Instead, we must continue to forge a common vision and purpose around the idea of facilitating cross-border cooperation between and among education authorities, schools, teachers, and students across the Americas. All countries in our region are fully engaged in operationalizing the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs, but I believe that not many have fully assessed the role of education in bringing about the transformational changes that the agenda requires. While we are not able to fully implement every good idea, there are certainly some common issues, challenges, and opportunities on which we can focus. Key among these is ensuring that the classroom experience contributes to the long-term and sustainable development of individuals. The clear message from within our region and elsewhere is that key to the long-term and sustainable development of individuals is their resilience. We must therefore adopt a holistic approach to building global citizens who are prepared to actively participate in a global economy, where diversity and inclusiveness are true strengths, not weaknesses. We must build the skills, knowledge, behaviors, leadership, confidence, motivation, and mindsets of our people. And we must strengthen the role of culture on their consciousness and their ability to assimilate the right values. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I believe that education is a right for all, not a privilege for a few. Every child has the right to be a student based on his or her ability to learn. No country can afford to exclude children from its intellectual and labor force. Our schools and communities must be the places where talent is developed and nurtured. I believe that by working together, each according to our own competencies, we can each contribute to ensuring the right to quality, inclusive, and equitable education for all in the Americas, and I emphasize for all. We have an obligation, a responsibility, and a duty to ensure that future generations are architects of their own destiny. All people of the Americas, regardless of race, gender, place of birth, or sexual identity or orientation, must have access to quality and inclusive education, must be empowered to aspire to quality jobs and more sustainable models of existence. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Kim, for those excellent remarks. Before we go to our panel, we want to show a very short video, courtesy of CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, that is supporting this project. So,
CAF, Banco de Desarrollo de América Latina, está convencido de que la educación es una herramienta clave para reducir las inequidades en la región y promover un desarrollo económico y social para América Latina. En este sentido, promover políticas educativas que promuevan esta reducción de la inequidad es una tarea prioritaria para las políticas públicas de la región. En este sentido, es importante reconocer que si bien se han hecho grandes avances, especialmente en lo que tiene que ver con los incrementos de cobertura, los incrementos de acceso, especialmente a educación primaria y secundaria, durante las 2 últimas décadas, aún restan importantes desafíos. Desafíos que tienen que ver con el acceso especialmente en primera infancia y en asegurar que los jóvenes terminen la educación secundaria. Desafíos con mejorar la calidad en todas y cada una de las modalidades y segmentos de la educación. Poder asimismo cerrar las brechas que existen entre las habilidades y capacidades demandadas por el mercado laboral y las que ofrecen nuestros sistemas educativos. Por último, en cuanto a sistemas educativos, es importante que desde los gobiernos de la región podamos invertir más y mejor en gasto educativo, haciendo un uso más eficiente y equitativo. Para atender estos desafíos, CAF, a través de su Agenda Educativa 2017-2022, ha priorizado 4 ejes estratégicos. Estos 4 ejes tienen que ver, en primer lugar, con acceso, y acceso mediante infraestructura de calidad, ambientes educativos que promuevan el aprendizaje. En segundo lugar, calidad. Calidad en todos los niveles, con un foco especial en educación inicial, que promueva un desarrollo integral de la primera infancia. Asimismo, en lo que tiene que ver con calidad, es especialmente importante enfocarnos en la formación del personal docente y directivo de nuestros centros. En lo que tiene que ver con pertinencia, trabajamos en cerrar las brechas entre las habilidades que demanda la inserción efectiva en el mercado laboral y que a través de una educación adecuada permite que los jóvenes no salgan del sistema educativo hasta culminar la secundaria. Y por último, de forma transversal, apoyamos sistemas educativos con una gestión más efectiva y eficiente, de tal forma que el seguimiento, el monitoreo, la planificación del sistema pueda contribuir a una educación de calidad. Estos retos son retos que es necesario atender a través de un esfuerzo sinérgico y colaborativo entre los diferentes actores involucrados en mejorar los sistemas educativos de la región. En este sentido, celebramos este espacio de diálogo que la Organización de Estados Americanos abre con la publicación de la guía que hoy nos convoca. A través de esta guía se permiten compartir experiencias exitosas que se han dado en los países de la región y que permitirá identificar cuáles son aquellas herramientas para tener mejores políticas públicas que reduzcan la inequidad en nuestros sistemas educativos. En particular, haciendo foco en educación inicial, donde se forman las habilidades fundamentales que se irán haciendo efectivas a lo largo de toda la vida del niño y después adulto, con un foco importante en el desarrollo neuronal, psicoemocional y cerebral del niño. En segundo lugar, con las políticas educativas en la educación primaria, donde se forman habilidades básicas en lectura y uso de matemáticas que son necesarias para adquirir posteriormente habilidades y competencias más complejas. En tercer lugar, hay un foco muy importante en poder apoyar la educación secundaria, a poder apoyar a estos jóvenes de tal manera que una vez que culminan la secundaria puedan seguir estudiando o insertarse en el mercado laboral, de forma que contribuyan a un mercado laboral también más efectivo, a una sociedad y a una ciudadanía más importante para el desarrollo de la región y poder procurar reducir también la presencia de los mercados informales de trabajo. Por último, me gustaría agradecer tanto a la Organización de Estados Americanos, especialmente a su Departamento de Inclusión Social, como al Diálogo Interamericano, socio de CAF y de la OEA en la elaboración de esta guía, por los esfuerzos realizados para poder llegar a este producto, que desde la perspectiva de CAF será usado en nuestro diálogo sectorial y en nuestra colaboración con los países miembros para propender hacia políticas educativas más inclusivas.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Oviedo. I am a part of the education team here at the Dialogue, and I am so excited to share what we spent many months working on, which is this Inter-American Guide on Strategies for Reducing Educational Inequality. And although the title is very long, the report does exactly as the title suggests. We selected 10 of the strategies that are most effective for the policies are that we looked at. We're going to go into greater depth on one of them, which happens to be my personal favorite, and one where we have some of the best empirical evidence, home visits. Home visits are structured visits by a trained professional to an at-risk family. It's usually, they go into their homes, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in their homes. It can be in a clinic, in a group setting, but usually these trained personnel go to a home where they talk to the caregiver, usually the mother, and they provide them with the necessary resources and skills so that the mother can raise children who are healthy and ready to learn. There is abundant evidence that these programs are extremely effective at improving outcomes that are academic and not only academic. This is one example from the region. It is the Kuna Mouse program from Peru. It is relatively recent if you compare it to other home visiting programs that exist in the region. But as you can see here, some of the short-term effects that were seen in a recent IDB report are, improved motor and socio-emotional skills, more play was observed, and other benefits. But other results, which have been doing these studies for much longer, are longitudinal results, studies, and what they do is that they track children who have attended these programs as they age and become young adults and adults, and they see what impacts having participated in a home visiting programs had in their lives. And two of the most well-known programs at a global level are the Nurse-Family Partnership in the US, which is implemented nationally, and this one study in Jamaica that was implemented by the Jamaican government, which combined nutrition and behavior, And what we saw in these two is that even years after the program, in the case of Jamaica, even 22 years after the program, students had greater cognitive skills, higher grades, and greater educational attainment. So there is no doubt home visiting programs are extremely effective. From looking at all this data, we learned some very valuable lessons that we think will be useful to policymakers and practitioners. The first is that the quality of home visits is crucial for program success, particularly for vulnerable families. You know, there's no single definition of what a high quality home visiting program is, but some indicators include the frequency of visits, the duration of visits, the degree to which the visitors are adhering to the curriculum, and also the quality of the interpersonal relationship between the home visitor and the caretaker. Unfortunately, an IDB study of 7 home visiting programs in the region showed that there's still a lot to be done to improve quality. For instance, visitors do not always complete all the required activities. They don't always review what was done in the previous session. They don't always ask mothers for feedback, etc. So there's a lot to do there. Second, visitors must follow a well-developed curriculum, one that is based on evidence and outlines the content of each visit, the messages that visitors must provide to caretakers, the toys they must play with, the educational materials they should provide, etc. And standardizing as much as possible makes it very easy to monitor quality. However, studies in the US also show that it is actually good to have some degree of flexibility. In the Nurse-Family Partnership program I was just mentioning earlier, the nurses who had the lowest dropout rates were the ones who knew how to tailor the curriculum just a little bit to fit the needs of families. So in order to strike that balance while maintaining quality, home visitors are going to need a lot of training. The third lesson we learned from these is that observation instruments are critical for monitoring and evaluation. There are a number of widely used instruments for monitoring the quality of these programs and the degree of adherence to the curriculum. Some are used by the home visitor herself so that she can self-assess how well she's doing. Some are used by supervisors. And overall, what we need is to invest in these so that they are more cost-effective and able to be used in any context. The fourth lesson is that home visitors require a lot of training, especially in Latin America, where most do not have advanced degrees. And in fact, in many programs, the only requirement is that they know how to read and write. We know that paraprofessional and professional home visitors can be equally as effective, but paraprofessional home visitors need the most training. And evidence shows that the best training is personalized and based on the observation of their performance, which is why these instruments are so important, these observation instruments. And finally, the last lesson we learned here is that home visiting programs are among the most cost-effective early childhood interventions. They are actually cheaper than child care centers and preschools because since they're visiting a home, there's no investment in infrastructure, there's no investment in food as you would have in a child care center, but it has the same impact or even greater, which is why we think it is so important to continue to improve them in the region. And just as I just did, I just told you, what are home visiting programs, what programs exist, what have we learned. This that I just did, we applied to the other 9 strategies. And that, I hope, will give you a sense of what is in this report and, all the work that went into it. And so with that said, once we finished, we learned a lot of lessons that we think are extremely valuable to countries in the region. And the lessons we learned is that, first of all, the lessons we learned is that countries must prioritize funding for programs aimed at reducing educational inequality. It is not enough to implement programs that are good for the average student, and instead funding must be earmarked to programs that target low-income and vulnerable communities specifically. This requires countries to know the cost-benefit ratios of different programs, and in terms of implementation, it might require some level of decentralization, given that local authorities often have the best understanding of local needs. The next lesson we learned is that programs must start by clearly identifying target populations and their specific needs. We know that poor and vulnerable children almost always benefit the most from educational interventions, and to maximize the efficiency of investments, we must know who these children are. One way to do this is through well-designed targeting mechanisms. These targeting mechanisms or methods are often used nationally by multiple ministries to identify the potential beneficiaries of social protection programs. There's a few countries in the region that do this well, and these are Colombia and Mexico, to name a couple, but in the rest of the countries, they're either underutilized or they suffer from serious design flaws, whereby they often do not capture all the people who need to be targeted, or they capture people who should not be a part of these programs and are hence taking away the opportunity from someone else. So improving them should be a huge priority. And besides these targeting mechanisms, another way to focalize efforts is by focusing on schools with poor educational indicators, such as low performance, high dropout rates, etc. And within schools, there's ways to identify the individual students who need the most help, such as through early warning systems, which are basically systems to detect which students have been missing, an abnormal number of school days, which students are failing in school, and it tells teachers and school officials that an intervention is needed. The next lesson we learned is that programs require greater collaboration between ministries and agencies. Inequality is rooted in causes that often falls outside the education system. Coordination means that ministries must stop working in silos and instead work together to set common goals and targets, to align their budgets and even share costs. This kind of coordination is especially beneficial in early childhood, where the family unit and the health system are such an important part of the child's life. Next, reducing educational inequality requires long-term strategies that encompass all age levels. The students who are performing poorly in secondary school and are most likely to drop out most likely developed lags in primary school. And those children are most likely those who attended poor quality preschool or did not attend at all. And those children are most likely students who did not receive the best nutrition or the best stimulation as young children. So this is a spectrum, and hence strategies must adopt a longitudinal vision that encompasses all grade levels. This means that curricula need to align well among all grade levels, and additionally, it means that we must devise strategies to make the transitions between levels as smooth as possible. Just to give you an example, the transition year between primary and secondary school is the year where a large proportion of the dropout rates in high school occurs, because it is just a year where students just encounter a lot of difficulties. So making those transitions as easy as possible should be a priority. And finally, the last lesson we learned is that programs must be framed within broad national plans for reducing educational inequality. These plans must explicitly define goals and objectives, action plans, monitoring and evaluation plans, and assign roles to all the different relevant institutional actors. At the same time, we must have mechanisms to learn from the effectiveness of programs that are already taking place and share this knowledge with others. All this will enable countries to guarantee all children their right to a high-quality education. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Maria. Is it working? Now it is. Okay. So thanks, Maria, for that presentation. The 10 strategies, are some more important than others? Are we missing something big here? Is the overall structure of the guide adequate in that sense?
Thank you very much, Ariel, and thank you, Maria, for the presentation, which is excellent. I enjoyed reading the guide a lot and think it's very well based on evidence, and in that sense, there's a lot of research that clearly went into it, and to tease out from the global literature what works, and then to organize it in a way that really highlights 10 actionable strategies that all countries should really be adopting and implementing. And as Maria said, not exactly in the same way. I think it kind of gives a flavor of what are some options, what are some examples of programs in each of the 10 strategies. But each country can think about how best this would work for them. If I were to add something, I would, particularly in the final lessons that cut across all the strategies, I would add two things to those. I think one is I agree that financing should go to the most vulnerable and most disadvantaged students. At the same time, financing is only one part of the resources. So one of the things we were studying a lot at the IDB is, how to improve education outcomes, and particularly for disadvantaged and have close learning gaps, by thinking about how teachers are allocated to schools. Because in most of our region, we know that depending on the seniority of the teacher and the career structure, they get to select which schools to teach at. And we know that although not, the most experienced teachers are not necessarily the best, we do know that the most novice teachers are usually not the best. That the first 2 or 3 years are really when the teacher's learning. And so the schools that need the best teachers are usually getting the novice teachers and a lot of teacher turnover. So another, I think, lesson across is how to, at all levels, try to think about how systems allocate perhaps the most important resource of all, which is the adult that's going to be interacting with the students. And then the other thing that I think is another area that we're really working a lot with governments across the region, and it goes to that point about coordination and collaboration across agencies, but also even within ministries of education that have divisions of early childhood and primary and secondary, is how to have really good and strong data systems that in today's world should be accessible to most of our countries, so that they can better identify student needs and better serve them within the system and across levels and with all the other services that should go with education. So I'll leave it at that.
It's very good points, and I think let's keep them, keep track of them, because I think human resources and information are probably two of the issues we want to come back to as we move along the discussion. Matilde, from thinking not from the education policy perspective per se, but thinking more from a social inclusion perspective, and recognizing that education is in fact an area in which the fight for social inclusion needs to take place. Any thoughts about what you heard and the proposed 10 strategies and how they fit in a broader social inclusion strategy?
Well, I guess thank you also for the invitation, and also I have to take the opportunity to especially thank Ariel Fisbein, the Inter-American Dialogue, and Maria Oviedo for collaborating with the OAS in this product, the Inter-American Guide. So the first thing I want to say is that we were part of putting together the guide, and specifically our main purpose was to ensure that this vision of the Secretary General, Luis Almagro, of more rights for more people was embedded in the contents of the guide, in the understanding that education is a human right as our Inter-American normative instruments state, the Charter of the OAS, as well as, and specifically, the additional protocol to the Convention on Human Rights, the Protocol of San Salvador, that addresses economic, social, and cultural rights, and of which education is one of them. And another point that I want to make is that our mission at the OAS is to develop technical tools, practical tools for policymakers to ensure that this agenda of bringing more rights to people is actually achieved. And we thought of this guide as one of those tools that, as Maria earlier mentioned, is based on empirical evidence of what has actually worked in other contexts of the region. And again, trying to balance this perspective of the Latin American context as well as the Caribbean context. And then the premise behind our work in this subject, and it was already mentioned, is that educational inequality has countless of reasons or causes that are not always school related, and we wanted to put a particular emphasis on the situation of groups in vulnerable situations that are also part of the mandate that we have at the Department of Social Inclusion and also at the OAS. That includes, of course, children with disabilities, migrant and refugee children, indigenous and Afro descendants. And then again, it goes directly linked to this idea of addressing the educational inequality challenges from different sectors, which is what you were saying, Emiliana. So there's, in that regard, something that the guide is bringing to the discussion and that we hope with the participation of the Social Inclusion Department was also highlighted. And then we can go, Maria highlighted the proposals found in this strategy of the home visits. But a couple of those we were very interested in, and we think, again, bring an interesting perspective to this discussion is what's addressed in the inclusive education component of the guide. That when you read the guide, you'll see that it's not just in the primary education sort of a line of the guide, but it's also present in all the discussion. And this idea that we also we have the mandate, but we also believe we need to incorporate is this idea that we shouldn't have special schools, but segregation is not the answer, but real social inclusion is integrating kids with different needs in the school systems. And this is something that is very well documented in the guide and is actually helping inform some of the programs and projects that we have at the OAS. And we can talk about later what some of those programs are. And again, with the idea of aligning those, how we ensure that governments are able to align those programs, projects, interventions with the commitments that they've made at the inter-American level in terms of ensuring these rights for kids. And then the second one that is also included in the guide is this intercultural bilingual education, specifically addressing the situation of indigenous children, in which we had some interesting interventions reflected in the guide, but the guide also makes evident that there's so much to be done in this regard, and it goes back to training teachers, but there's a host of other issues, including developing instructional materials in indigenous languages that we also need to be working on at the regional level. That, again, the guide points them out, but there's still a lot to be done in that regard.
So you commented on the inclusive education strategy, and one thing that I found particularly shocking, if you want, when we're working on that chapter, is recognizing that a majority of the countries in the region already have in the books laws that and policies that mandate the inclusion of children with special needs into the mainstream schools. Okay, but that then when we looked at to what extent that is happening, we see a huge gap. Now, this is perhaps not that surprising to those of us that work in Latin America, which is the gap between rhetoric and reality, right? The fact that we move a lot faster and easier when it comes to defining things and putting them on a piece of paper than when it comes to actually implementing. So the Maria went through some of these, cross-cutting issues that we believe, based on the evidence that we reviewed, are important for these programs to actually achieve results. But I think there is a broader question here, which is more perhaps even a political economy question, as to whether we're thinking in terms of inclusive education or bilingual and multicultural education or home visits. It is what is missing in the way of social demands, human capacities, governance, whatever way you want to approach it, for this more scientific approaches that we often discuss in our reports to actually be taken to scale and have the impact that whether it's the SDGs or the Inter-American education agenda, the goals that are actually sort of we all seem to agree on, at least at the rhetorical level. So I know this is sort of a big challenge, but I would like us to explore a little bit about what is missing for us to make this a reality rather than just a nice picture on a book. I know, Emiliana, if you want to get started on
that's
that.
such an easy question. So I think you're right that there was a time when evidence was weak in education of what worked. And there's a recent article in, I think it came out in Education Week, saying, we know, for example, how to teach literacy and early reading. Why don't we do it well? There's certainly a science and an evidence base. And yet, in Latin America and in the US, there's a lot of still beliefs about how this should be done that go counter to the evidence. And it's very hard to break those beliefs and traditions, and I think in education, especially so. I think, I actually think a lot about this, and I think in health, the whole medical field of medicine kind of grew from the scientific research tradition, where it was okay to test things like, have some people who were sick getting a placebo treatment and others getting something experimental and see if it works. And it was okay to risk people's lives, and it has been okay for decades and for even more than that in the health sciences. But in the education sciences, when policymakers are thinking that something will work without actually having evidence, they really fight hard to implement it at scale and to not exclude anyone because they think they're not going to respect someone's right. And so changing that view has been really difficult, I think. And I mean, we have had some successes. A lot of the evidence that was discussed in the guidelines really comes from those few, I would say, for the size of the problem, experiments or really rigorous trials that have been conducted where we have been able to learn using the scientific method what works. I think it's a combination of how do you, one of my colleagues says, evidence is great, but teachers, la evidencia está bien, pero la gente tiene creencias. People have beliefs. And in education, I think more than in perhaps other fields, even the legal field goes by legal precedent. So I think we need to work collectively to kind of bring more scientific research into the education thing. And I think it starts with teacher education programs, to have the institutions that provide the training really be more scientific in their own approaches and study, what's happening to those people we are training afterwards. Where are they working and how are they performing? What are their students learning? There's very little of that going on across even advanced countries.
So in other words, go back to a point you made earlier, we need to change the teaching profession for these things to actually be taken to scale. I guess that's the implicit
Yeah, but
message.
I would not blame it on the teachers. I think it's a whole way in which this has evolved, and in Latin America in particular, sort of the teaching has become a path to the middle class and a way that politicians also give back to their voters. And so I think we need to kind of rethink how education systems should be managed, or what they're there for. Also, frankly, rethink how we group students. We've historically grouped them by age. Does that make sense in this day and age where we can assess more quickly where they're at and provide more personalized learning? You talk a lot about this in the report. So a lot of things we could
There's
do
a number of
differently.
angles.
So many angles.
Matilde, so from your perspective, looking at these issues not from inside the education system, but from the side. Again, what are the bottlenecks that, if we really want to take this inclusion agenda seriously and take it to scale, what are the key bottlenecks that need to be addressed at the institutional, political level? 2-3 things that you think are missing.
Yeah, well, two of the ones that connecting with Porto right before coming up here, he was emphasizing, and we were having a discussion on which already has been mentioned, the need to strengthen the teacher profession and to give capacities to teachers. And this is something that the OAS has done, and so much more needs to be done in that regard. So that definitely is one. In knowing how to, from the standpoint of the vulnerable groups that we have a mandate to tend to, how you differentiate, how you impart the content based on a migrant child who doesn't necessarily know the culture, the language, versus the rest. I mean, one of the things that is crucial is this idea of teacher training. And then the second one that has a lot to do with the type of work that we do at the OAS is ensuring intersectoral or interministerial coordination. It's one of the lessons that is highlighted in the guide that Maria mentioned in her presentation, and it's something that when we support member states in the work that they do addressing these types of challenges, we see that it is kind of like the common denominator country to country is how to ensure that all the ministries that have something to do with ensuring a good trajectory of life, social mobility for their citizens, works in a coordinated way. And this doesn't happen. This is a challenge. And there's certain good practices that have been implemented. One of those highlighted in the guide is that of the conditional cash transfers and how you connect also the health sector with the education sector to ensure that these children are given more opportunities. But there's so much, especially on that regard, in terms of coordinating between sectors, where I would see is one of the things that needs to be, one of the hurdles we need to pass in order for these strategies to succeed.
Yeah, I think, and that's why we've emphasized, you've seen that one of the bottom line messages is the need to invest in this sort of intersectoral arrangements and the role of how important it's to have a well-defined strategy with targets, with responsibilities, so that no agency, everyone needs to play along, and accountabilities are clear. I think it's a good moment to perhaps open to a few questions from the audience. Do we have microphones around? And also, if perhaps the air conditioning can be.
It's kind of hot.
I thought it was me, but okay, yeah. So here.
Thank you. I was wondering if I could ask a question about financing of education. So in the United States, a big criticism of the education system is that the amount of money that goes to a given school is dependent on the zip code where the school is. So the poorest schools get the lowest funding. I wonder if that system is common in other countries in the Americas and what an alternative system might be.
Let's take a few very good questions. I know Emiliana is jumping to answer it, but let's take a few more up there.
Good afternoon. One of the points that was made was being able to specifically identify target audiences. And I wanted to find out what empirical evidence have you seen that specifically talks about the impacts to Afro-Latino or African-descendant communities who are the most marginalized when you talk about some of these particular issues? And have you seen some specific best practices also in the area of bilingual or intercultural education that perhaps include Garifuna communities as well, and expanding upon engagement of indigenous communities?
Yeah, and let's the gentleman in the back, and then.
Is this on? Yeah. So historically, schools of education have been decoupled from departments of cognitive science. And in the past few decades, we've learned more about human learning than in all of human history combined. So schooling cannot afford to be detached from learning, but it has been, and it continues to be. To what extent is the IDB or the OAS thinking about programs that might be able to cost-effectively measure the cognitive readiness of students to learn, and then design programs that enhance cognitive abilities directly? And secondarily, is anyone thinking about learning science as something that must be taught for teacher training so they can be ready to succeed? If you don't understand the science of learning, how can you teach? So.
And one more question over there.
Hi, first of all, thank you. My question is pertaining to family planning. Like, do you have anything on family planning, especially for girls in school, as adolescent pregnancy is extremely common, unfortunately, and is like a main, or I guess like a great motivator for school desertion?
Good. Let's take this 4 questions, and then depending on how long it takes, we may have a second round. But perhaps, Emiliana, you can start with the financing question.
So the way that school systems are financed in other countries in the Americas is usually not like in the U.S. It's usually not dependent on the local government, and particularly the kind of the zip code, as you said it. Like, however, it really does vary by countries. There are some countries where the regions or states play an important role in the financing of education, such as Colombia, Argentina, to some extent Mexico, but then there are, and certainly Brazil, where both states and districts kind of share in the financing. But also there are mechanisms to alleviate those inequalities. So Brazil, for example, has a national level law where they collect resources from all states and kind of redistribute to ensure at least a certain level of spending per pupil in all the country, independent of how wealthy a certain state or municipality is. So there's a lot of differences.
Yeah.
A lot of interesting things. And actually we have, if you're interested in that topic, we have a technical note in the IDB website on financing in Latin America. And we just published a book, which was our development in the Americas, which is called Better Spending for Better Lives, and it has a good chapter on education as well.
Very good.
And perhaps the issue of Afro-Americans and how the issue is being worked on, looked at, what's the experience from your side, your neck of the wood?
Sure. In the particular case of Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples, this is a topic that's always been addressed within the OAS, but more recently, with much more force and more power, and the member states approve an action plan to kind of bring to our region the tenets of the decade of the Afro-descendant people at the global level. And one of the things that specifically touches on is education. However, the question that you were asking was in terms of data. In a recent experience we just had regarding the presentation of reports of the members, the state parties to the Protocol of San Salvador, specifically on education, is that there's data, indeed. There's, ever more data than before. However, there is a need to start disaggregating this data regarding access to education, and they have a series of indicators at the structural level in terms of process and policies implemented, as well as results, indicators regarding results. The process of presenting report makes evident that there's a lot of data missing in terms of specific populations. In the specific case of Afro-descendants, what we do know from studies that have been done at the IDB and other institutions is that the Afro-descendants are predominantly present in those who are poor. So we do know that they have limited access to schools, and when they do have access to school, there is of lesser quality. There's a couple of programs documented in the guide that I would invite you to take a look at, and we at the OES are trying to systematize additional best practices regarding guaranteeing access to quality education to Afro-descendants.
And just to add to that, there are, at the IDB, we've done a couple of randomized controlled trials in Paraguay, and now we're doing one in Panama, where we're introducing programs to help teachers who serve indigenous communities teach young children math and science using kind of their native language and with kind of very guided instruction. In Paraguay, we've had a lot of success, and we expect to also observe a lot of impact in the one in Panama, which is just beginning. And also, the IDB has just approved a diversity action plan for our work with countries, and it includes not just racial and ethnic minorities, but also LGBTQ+, and our goal is really to, and people with disabilities. And our goal is really to work with governments, and we're already doing it. We had our first loan to the government of Ecuador to improve inclusion of people with disabilities in education, health, and social protection. And so we're really seriously committed as an institution to building more evidence, because as Betile was saying, there are data, but they're not usually well studied or made available really in a form that you can act upon, and there's less evidence on what works. And so we have now an expert in the house helping advise our work. So stay tuned. We're very excited about. We do have a technical note also on education and disabilities in Latin America on our website that I invite you to look at.
Let me just add that in preparing the guide, we did find less data and evidence related to Afro-descendants than to indigenous communities. Okay, it was easier. Correct me, Maria, if I'm wrong, but it was, okay, she approves. It was easier to find the kind of evidence that we were looking for in the case of interventions addressed to, say, bilingual education related to indigenous languages than the inclusion of children from Afro-descendant communities. It was sort of the gentleman asked, when is the science of learning going to permeate into the education system? And I guess the presumption or the theory of change is that we'll have to start from teacher training. Emiliana, is it starting to happen or not yet?
It's beginning to happen, I think, at a much slower pace than we would all want. I think it's certainly beginning in this country. It also was not historically present in schools of education in advanced countries either. So it's an interesting, I think this is also an area where, as you said, the evidence on how the brain works throughout the life cycle has increased exponentially. We now know that adolescence is a particular period in the brain, and why, adolescents tend to be engage in more risky behaviors. That's a lot to do with brain development. The same thing with early childhood, and then adulthood. We know now that we can continue to learn and expand our brain power way into adulthood and old age. And so I think all of that is beginning to permeate, and but not at the pace that I would like, for sure. And of course, that's also a source of inequality, because the more advanced countries are incorporating this evidence more quickly than those countries that have less resources and less access. So
yeah,
part of the challenge.
It is, and I imagine that it's going to be a long-term process, because essentially you're not going to see it while you can do it through in-service training. There you're only sort of acting at the margins, and the real change is going to be once initial training, teacher training programs really are modernized and respond to the new science, and that won't happen overnight. So it ain't easy. Teenage pregnancy. Again, not a topic. It's a topic that we could have had as one of the chapters, and in retrospect, perhaps in the version 2.0, we ought to include it. But any thoughts on this?
So I think there's an issue with, in general, that you do cover somewhat, but maybe for the next version, which has to do with in secondary education, why in Latin America do we have such high proportions of students dropping out, even in countries where it's kind of inexplicable, like in Uruguay, 60% of students drop out of secondary school before they complete. And it has a lot to do with how conservative the systems have been and how little they have changed over time. And students really report that it's not just because they need to work, like in the past. A lot of students would drop out in order to help their families earn income, or to supplement with child rearing. It's more because they're bored and they don't see the relevance of education. That doesn't go straight to the point of the girls and pregnancy issues. That has more to do, I think, with what is policies to improve gender parity. And again, that has been an issue that at the IEB we are innovating for the first time in the last year or so. We've approved a few loans to governments like Argentina and Panama, as different as those two can be, that cut across social sectors but include programs at the school level to better inform girls and boys about kind of sexuality and sexual behavior and to prevent pregnancy. That's not uncontroversial. So it's been, some government, Peru and Colombia are two cases that come to mind where ministers had to resign due to efforts to introduce sexual education in schools. But we do have some progressive countries that are adopting this, and at least the IDB is certainly supporting these efforts.
I would have to agree, and this is something that in the realm of the OAS is the Inter-American Commission of Women is actually been trying to bring to the agenda, because Latin America has the highest rates of pregnancy, teen pregnancy, is that how you say it? Adolescent pregnancies. And I think it's part of a more structural conversation that definitely impacts the education and also the health sectors in the countries, of whether or not to bring sexual education to the schools and to make that available to boys and girls. And in the specific moment that we are, unfortunately, this has not been the side where we bring this education to the children is not winning, and we have to see how this is going to get resolved.
Yeah, I agree with both of you, and my sense is that this is going to become more and more of a sort of an active area. On the one hand, on the positive side, compared to 10 years ago, I do see now more ministries of education willing and to talk about this and getting engaged. On the other hand, the backlash from some segments of society has been brutal, and Emiliana, when the two cases that you mentioned were in Peru just a few weeks ago, and I was being interviewed on, this was a program on early childhood development, and the only thing that the journalists wanted to talk about was sexual education and gender-based education, because it has become a really controversial issue. So it's very good that you raised it. I think we have a few minutes to get a couple more questions. I discriminated against this side of the room before, so.
Hi. I was wondering if the IDB is considering in supporting results-based financing. I'm sure that you know that in India there's a successful example with Educate Girls. They implemented a development impact fund, and school enrollment rates, completion rates, and learning outcomes improved significantly. So I was wondering if you are supporting this type of mechanisms.
Good. Any other questions on this side? Yes, in the back.
Hello. How important is in this later stages of development of education the STEM concept?
Okay, and let's see. Okay, there.
Hi there. So you've given a lot of recommendations on how to improve the education system for students who are already in it. I'm wondering if you have any recommendations to perhaps reach out and include youth who have already dropped out of schools. Obviously, it was mentioned before, the millions of students who aren't even in the education system. And those are obviously the most vulnerable and disadvantaged students as well.
So the question is about what happens with young people that have already abandoned school. How do you bring them back? Right? Yes. Okay. And last question. Anyone on that side? Well, then we'll go back there.
Do you have some recommendations or comments for civil societies, NGOs, or organizations, religious organizations that are working on education and want to implement these recommendations, but in governments where there is no willingness to address inequality?
Very good question. That's the $1 million question. So let's get started. I think there was a question for you on results-based financing.
Yes. The short answer is yes. We are currently in the process of designing what we hope will be something we call the Education Mesoamerica Initiative. So the IDB has very good experiences with results-based financing in health in Mesoamerica, which is Mexico and Central America. And it's been a 10-year-long program, co-financed with the Slim Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to help reduce child and maternal mortality. And so the lessons from that have been incredibly valuable to the IDB in terms of how do you work with governments and private donors and the bank with our own lending instruments to, identify measurable goals and targets, and then have a similar but different intervention strategies depending on where countries are in kind of their own system development. And so stay tuned. We're working on that a lot. We have a team basically dedicated full time to developing that initiative, and we're hoping to launch it in early 2020.
Great. On the question on re-entry, we do have one of the chapters in the guide is exactly focused on that. So I encourage you to read it. But perhaps for both of you, any thoughts that you want to put forward on how to address those already abandoned schools?
I mean, in our work, we are focusing a lot on technical vocational education, also with the labor markets division, trying to see that as an opportunity to both help develop the skills, not just those technical and vocational skills, but socio-emotional skills and life skills, and keep students in school. Because once you offer them an education that they do find interesting and relevant, it's more likely to retain them, but also to attract out-of-school young adults through the kind of non-formal education system or non-formal training. And doing that very closely aligned to and working with the private sector and the productive sector so that we're training people for jobs that do exist and that will exist in the future. So that's kind of my short answer. It's a very challenging program, and we don't have a lot of evidence of very good and successful programs that have worked to attract youth back into school. And that's one of the goals also of the initiative I was talking about, because in Central America, as we all know, a lot of youth have dropped out of school and are actually engaged in all sorts of other activities that are not necessarily productive or healthy. So.
Yeah. On the question on STEM, which is not something that we discuss in the context of this report, it has a very interesting angle, which is the gender angle, which again, it's could be argued is part of the equity agenda, it's a topic that Latin America is only now, I think, starting to wake up to it. No, Emiliana?
Yes. So just for those of you who, like me, don't necessarily know all the acronyms, STEM means science, technology, engineering, and math education. And historically, it hasn't been the best in our region. If you look at the international assessments of student learning, PISA, we tend to do very poorly in general, but particularly bad in math and science compared to countries of similar socioeconomic status, and also countries, of course, that are richer. So that's an area of great concern to many countries, of course, to the IDB. We've been working a lot on how to change both cultural perceptions about women and girls in science and math, with a partnership that we have with Sesame Workshop, for example. And also on the more research side, we have a book by my colleagues Emma Naslund Hadley and Rosamund Lavando that is actually, I saw quite cited in the guidelines, that looks really deeply into how should science and math be taught in schools in Latin America. What are some best practices, and also what is the evidence from how the brain works should be used to inform teacher education. So I think that's...
I guess one of the messages is, with many other things, is start early.
Yes.
Don't wait until it's too late in the life cycle. So I think that's sort of one of the common issues. And finally, and I guess with this we'll bring the session to closure, we have Sergio's challenging question as to this, all based on the assumption that the government is interested and committed, and so it's a question of having the know-how. What do we do when there isn't that commitment?
Of course, I work for governments. We are an intergovernmental organization, but apart from that, I see day to day that, what you're saying is that they have no will. It's not that true. There is interest on the part of governments to make things work and to ensure that the policies that they implement have an impact on their people. So in that point, we can discuss later, but I have to disagree. I think there is. The governments are making an effort to ensure that, better results. And what recommendations can we give to civil society? And Emiliana, you complement, but in my view, you must engage, and there's processes that exist, both at the national level, but also, and I can talk about the regional ones, and we have Secretary Osborne here. In the framework of the OAS, there's a ministerial process that beyond the more political discussions that may not necessarily be the space for civil society, but they still need to happen at the regional level. There's a space, which is the Inter-American Education Agenda, that has very concrete action items in which civil society definitely has a role, because this is not something that only governments can do. Cooperation between civil society and governments must exist. So we can talk about it later, but there's spaces for civil society engagement. And I have Secretary Osborne who wants to add something to that point.
Thank you, Bathilde. I intended to stay quiet. But anyway, I wanted to support Bathilde's point in terms of commitment to ending inequality. At least for all member states, this remain at the forefront of the development agenda. I think across all our ministerial processes, whether we are talking social development, education, competitiveness, it's a recurring theme and a recurring commitment. So there is, I would say, political will. How quickly we are moving is another story, right? I mean, there are always competing, there's always competition for resources, et cetera, and we may not see it manifesting itself as quickly as we would like to in the area of education, but I would say for sure that commitment is there within the member states of the Americas, and we can only continue to engage, as Bathilde said, at every level. We recognize very strongly that development is not the responsibility of governments alone. So that we have to continue to work multi-sectorally. We have to continue to work across borders and across sectors in order for us to realize results. And education, again, is not the responsibility of just governments. I think all of us collectively have a role to play, whether we are development banks and other institutions. And in terms of civil society engagement, we've been doing a lot of work within the Secretariat on engaging with the private sector, engaging with NGOs, engaging with others in order for to achieve results. And finally, with regard to STEM, I just want one plug in. We have the Inter-American Teacher Education Network, and we now have new leadership of the I-10, and there's a strong focus, well, the sole focus of the I-10 now is on STEM education and teacher training specific to STEM. So we were very broad. We've now narrowed the focus, and we will be having in Peru in August the Inter-American Teacher Education Network Inter-American Seminar, and the focus is again on STEM education. So we are zooming in on ensuring teacher training on STEM education. Thank you.
I would just add that I like your question. I interpreted it differently, and it was more like, how can civil society organizations really kind of hold governments accountable for fighting inequality? And in that sense, I think Latin America has really good experiences from Brazil with Todos por la Educación and other organizations that have worked with governments in kind of generating national plans for education with specific goals and then really monitoring that. Argentina is beginning to start what they call Observatorio Nacional de Educación. Like it's a way of engaging with governments, and I think in a constructive way to say, okay, let's as a society agree that education is a priority, but not just like say, okay, let's invest 5% of GDP in education, or let's get universal primary education, but let's get much more specific as to what goals we need to achieve as a nation, and then have civil society not just contribute to deliver on them, but also monitor them and be the main, because governments change, and it's really society that remains and should be vigilant.
No, I would add in that sense, perhaps because I don't work for an intergovernmental organization, that I do see across Latin America to different degrees a certain growing level of frustration in this area on the part of civil society. Frustration with that gap between rhetoric and implementation, whether it's due to a lack of commitment or lack of capacity is arguable. But I do see an increasing impatience and frustration, and a search for civil society-led efforts. Some of these operate very directly in terms of lobbying and kind of building accountability pressures. And there are several countries in which that is happening. Others work more in terms of actual service delivery. And some of it is including through the private sector that are looking for how to build alternatives to what government is not delivering. So my personal sense is on this is that indeed that growing frustration and pressure needs to be channeled in ways that actually don't disperse efforts and really do push governments to be more, either to pay more attention or to be more effective at doing what they ought to be doing. And in that sense, forcing governments to not only sign broad declarations, but actually signing on to very specific plans that include targets, targets and measurable targets is part of the answer. It's 4:34, and we'd like to finish on time. So I want to thank all of you for coming today. I apologize for the heat. I think it would, I hope that we finally figured out what was wrong. And I want to thank both Betilde and Emiliana for your participation, and Maria for the wonderful presentation. There she is. And I really encourage you to check the website and look at the guia. And if you have any comments, suggestions, we always welcome them. We still don't know exactly what else we'll do on this, but we hope it's the beginning of an effort to really promote this agenda more generally. So thank you very much.